Today, I intend to look at the transcription of orchestral and choral music for solo performance on the organ. While doing so, I will first explore some academic issues and try to discern what, if any, influence these concerns have on the concert-going public at large, whose exposure to the organ as a concert instrument, that is, as opposed to its liturgical role, is likely limited, and even more so to those whose musical interests lie in the non-classical sphere. This demarcation is perhaps more marked in 2017 than in 1917, when organ recitals were a well-regarded civic and educational activity and are described so in the local print media of the day. Organists have perhaps been more exposed to and influenced by the musicological interest in historical accuracy and performance over the last 50 years than have most other instrumentalists. Over this period, numerous articles in periodicals such as The American Organist, The Diapason, Choir and Organ, Organist's Review, and many others have explored in some detail various aspects of earlier performance practices and instruments. In such an environment which values authentic, or at least historically informed performance, what is the place of the transcription? And I would suggest this is a bit of a loaded question on a variety of fronts. First of all, how do you define the term authentic? Does this mean the organ equivalent of period instruments like violins with gut strings and baroque bows, or woodwinds with limited or no mechanism, or valveless brass? Or does it mean a firm grasp of what are understood to be the performance conventions of the period during which the composer lived and to which, presumably, he subscribed? Or both together? And where does the principle of historically informed begin and end, especially the latter? For example, one current English organ periodical is actually looking at the legacy of the Blitz. Now, for some of that's almost within our memories. And how do all of these factors relate to altering the performance medium of a work? Unfortunately, for several generations of organists, including mine, the term transcription conjures up images of all sorts of 19th and 20th century musical horrors, such as Strauss waltzes or 1920s popular songs played on a Hammond organ with the Leslie speakers vibrating at full tilt, or the Wurlitzer theater organ with extra percussion and other sound effects. Now, the sound effects that Wurlitzer produced were great for the movies, and that's what they were designed for. But it can also be said that they appeared outside screen time. All these kinds of images need to be set aside, for while they exist, they comprised only a portion of the whole, and not a portion I wish to dwell on. Transcription as a method of performing music is almost as old as written music itself. Keyboard versions of lute and tabulations survive from the Renaissance. Bach himself rewrote some of his cantata arias as organ trios, now known as the Schubler chorales, and arranged violin concerti by Vivaldi for organ alone. Other Baroque composers such as Handel and Telemann, Couperin and Blavet generally wrote sonatas for treble instrument, which could be played with greater or lesser facility on the violin, the transverse flute, recorder, and oboe. We can say that this was probably in part a marketing ploy, but the fact remains that this was all taken into account. The 3 organ works by Mozart, written for mechanical instruments, have been transcribed and edited for human performance, as have those by Haydn and Beethoven. So there is a firm tradition for transcription as a valued part of musical production. Well, how then did this concept come to receive such opprobrium, at least in certain quarters of the musical world. For my generation, the early music movement was the key to the alteration of taste. When I was a child, lush, romantic sounds were still the norm, both in the orchestral world and that of the organ. Wanda Landowska was notable for playing the revival harpsichord. The film Fantasia, with its great sprawl of the Tchaikovsky version for orchestra of Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor, was still in the theaters, and orchestral organs were still being built in quantity. Such books as George Audley's The Art of Organ Building and the 20th Century Organ, along with Barnes's The Contemporary American Organ, were the authorities of the day, and I have them up here for you to look at should you wish to. But by the 1970s, at least in the United States, it was very different. Lushness was out, clarity was in. Legato was out. Detached playing and early fingering were the rage. Organists no longer admitted to playing or even liking works by Elgar, Stanford, Gilmour, and Rager. Barnes's book was scornfully referred to in my presence as the contemptible American organ instead of the contemporary one. Practice rooms at the Eastman School echoed to the strains of Frescobaldi, Clarenbow, Sweelinck, and lots of other early composers played on new instruments which had been built with pipes with lots of chiff, or that very articulated beginning to the sound, which sounds like somebody might spit at you at any moment. And if you weren't lucky enough to have one of these instruments to practice on, you played everything more or less staccato to compensate. And the romantic early 20th century transcription was not an acceptable adjunct to the repertoire. In a conversation just recently with the German organist Hans Hielscher, I learned that at least in Germany, this extreme bias seems to have been much less virulent. Whether this was an after effect of World War II, I cannot say, but there is one other effect of which I am sure. The large number of organist Fulbright scholars who descended on Western Europe brought back new ideas about organ construction and playing. Possibly they continued to push for ever brighter and cleaner sounds long after they had exceeded their European models, but the taste of the student body was thus changed. 40 years on again, the situation has shifted back. The pendulum of taste has come back a little bit, and in the organ world it is acceptable to enjoy the romantic repertoire. The transcription, so beloved by organists of a century ago, has been revived, although not quite in the same form. Modern transcribers and arrangers produce less complex, some would say less cluttered, versions of works for instrumental ensemble, by which I mean both chamber music and orchestra, as well as choral and solo originals. Textures are thinner. An octave doubling in the pedal rarely occurs, although these are by no means the simplified arrangements that we see published for beginning players. Martin Setchell of Christchurch, who has published multiple volumes of transcriptions, including a book of marches by John Philip Sousa, is our domestic exemplar of this type of work, and there are many others round the world. And I have a copy of Martin Setchell's Sousa marches if you're interested. It is possible to say that in organ departments of major universities and in the United States, transcriptions have been readmitted to the repertoire, even if only as a poor relation to works written for the organ as itself. And in May 2015, I heard evidence of this during a week-long stay at the Eastman School of Music when I was in and among the practice rooms there. But does any of this matter to the so-called common man, the person sitting out there listening? I think it does, but perhaps not in the manner that organ teachers and competition judges might hope. Perhaps the nearest many people could come to a clear idea of this concept of transcription might be to consider the relative merits of an original songwriter's performance of a song and compare it with cover editions by other performers. Why is this so? What have we organists done, or not done, to allow our performance medium to fade from public consciousness? I believe that one of the factors in this situation is the rigor with which the transcription was excised from our recital programs. While not advocating a return to the practice of programming that contains nothing but transcriptions, rather like the one that you can see on the bottom of page 3 of your handout, and none of the indigenous repertoire at all, it seems to me that a balance can be struck which could increase our audiences without doing damage to what we perceive as our own integrity. Recent experience would appear to back up this view. Let me introduce a few examples of my own. At the end of 2015, Douglas Muse played a recital in a large suburban church. After a first half of Baroque repertoire, which was politely received, he played Lemaire's arrangement of the main themes from Gounod's Faust. The change in the atmosphere was electric. Suddenly, here were tunes people could come along to that they vaguely knew already, even if they didn't know how they knew them and didn't know what the title was. That performance was applauded like nothing else in that program. During January of last year, Douglas and I played 2 mini recitals of 30 minutes each day, 6 days a week, here at St. Peter's on Willis Street. Those who came were caught by almost invariably the mix of either opera overture or show tune as part of the program, mixed in with so-called proper repertoire and turn-of-the-century mood pieces such as Lemaire's Andantino in D-flat. And for those of you of a certain age, that's the music for Moonlight and Roses. Just 2 days ago, while I was having a lesson here with Douglas and playing the Handel you will hear shortly, I was asked by an older couple what the piece was, because they enjoyed it so much and thought it was really grand. So why are generalist listeners ready to support what conservatory-trained musicians might have classified as easy listening at best and other things at worst? I submit that we need to return to the general public's basic musical and educational background. Think back on that of your own. What were you exposed to as a child and a teenager, both at home and in school? When I was an itinerant teacher in several Wellington secondary schools during the 1980s, the classical composers students were exposed to were limited to Bach, Handel, Mozart, and Tchaikovsky. The remainder of the year was spent looking at contemporary soloists, jazz, and pop ensembles. So given many people's limited classical music experience, and that fewer and fewer are exposed to the organ in any context whatsoever, is it a wonder that the organ recital is not considered a popular entertainment? Those who have brought the organ to popular attention, such as Virgil Fox, who lived from 1912 to 1980, Carlo Curley, who's a contemporary of mine, born in 1952 and died in 2012, and the young Cameron Carpenter, born in 1981, have, each in his own era, been showmen of exemplary skill who have taken the electronic or digital organ to the masses as well as bringing people to the pipe organ. All three have been vilified by the mainstream organist fraternity for the ways in which they have done so. But there are many YouTube clips available for each of these performers, and I would encourage you to have a look. And it is easy to see that each of them is adept in engaging his audience. Both Carlo Curley and Cameron Carpenter have done so here in New Zealand in relatively recent years. I suspect, though I certainly cannot prove, that city organists of the early 20th century in New Zealand had some of the same charisma and indulged in the same techniques. It is true that they had much less competition for the entertainment spend of their audiences, but I refuse to believe that lack of other options was the only driver for large attendances at organ recitals. And you can read in the Wellington Press about the town hall was only half full, and that this was considered a bad thing. Well, we know how many people the town hall can hold. Many communities of a variety of sizes had choral and orchestral societies as well. So there were other musical outlets which were also well supported. And this was true even in smaller centers like Invercargill or Gore or you name it. So let's just look briefly at what Maughan Barnett, who was the city organist first here in Wellington and then in Auckland, and Dr. John Bradshaw of Christchurch, and some other performers were playing that brought people to their presentations. Barnett, especially, made much use of César Franck in his programs, some of the organ works, of course, but also the Symphony in D minor. Well, that's a transcription and a half. Mendelssohn's organ sonatas were interspersed with arrangements of the Songs Without Words, symphonic movements such as sections of Symphony 4 or bits of Midsummer Night's Dream, oratorios such as Elijah and St. Paul, and chamber works. Selections from Handel oratorios were common, and not just Messiah, but also Judas Maccabeus, Samson, and many of the others. Dr. Bradshaw did less with Mendelssohn, but much more with Wagner, even to the point of playing whole programs based on a single opera. The mind boggles. Early 19th century operas were also featured. Meyerbeer's Le Prophète was a popular source, as were compositions by Rossini and Mascagni. Works originally for the organ tended to be French and English works of the late 19th century, although German works became more common once people started being exposed to the Leipzig Conservatory and the education they got there. Bach, while not wholly absent, is hardly the staple of organ recitals that he is now. There are never any BWV numbers in the advertisements or reviews, so you can't be sure what's being played. Sometimes, even within the organ works, there is more than one prelude and fugue in the same key. And we know, because we have copies of them, that William Best, who we will refer to later, made transcriptions of these works for the organ with additional pedal parts. So it's possible that that's what was being played in Christchurch or Invercargill or Wellington. Others, it's obvious. The St. Anne Fugue in E-flat comes from the third part of the Klavierübung, and the Toccata in F with pedal solos, well, there's only one of those, and that's BWV 540. So the weighting of programming 100 years ago was very different than it is today. But having discussed some of the reasons why transcriptions in general may be popular with the public in recitals both 100 years ago and now, let's look at some specific examples of the genre. At the end of this lecture, I'll be performing 3 transcriptions plus a work originally written for the organ for comparison and contrast. You have the program in front of you in the handout. You will notice the hand of the redoubtable William Thomas Best in 3 of these pieces. Best lived from 1826 to 1897, so he really does cover the 19th century. These works are highly representative of his general oeuvre in this area and are but several of the hundreds of transcriptions he made available through Novello and other publishers. The big pile on this table over here is his 5-volume set of over 1,000 pages of arrangements from the great masters. This is only one example of his written output. Others included a compilation called Cecilia, begun in 1883, a collection in 56 parts of original works by other composers as well as Best himself. A Tudor called The Art of Organ Playing in 1869. For the bicentennial of Bach's birth in 1885, Best began an edition of the organ works, but unfortunately, this was not completed at the time of his death. Best could be said to be a prime example of the power of musical education in the north of England during the 19th century. He was born in Carlisle, the son of a solicitor, and his father intended him to become a civil engineer. Thus, he was sent off to Liverpool at the age of 14 for study. Having had a few musical lessons with a Carlisle-based organist as a boy, and the sources differ as to who this person was, whether he was the cathedral organist or somebody else. But anyway, Best found himself employment as the organist of the Baptist Chapel in Pembroke Road, Liverpool. And we need to say that it is in this appointment lay the seeds of his lifelong career as a musician. And here I have to get a little bit technical. Organs as we know them today are built with a particular key compass, both for the manuals and the pedal, and the bottom note in each case is the C, 2 octaves below middle C. This was not the case in England prior to the late 1840s. But the Pembroke Road Chapel organ was one of these new C compass organs and included a CC pedal board. English organs generally had a manual that went a fourth lower to bottom G and very little in the way of pedal at all. So the organ in Pembroke Road Chapel was therefore ideal for an emerging organist who was keen to adopt the latest additions to his chosen instrument. Supposedly Best practiced at least 4 hours every day. He was basically an autodidact, as most English organists were unused to the complete pedal compass of the German-style instrument, which was being pushed by Mendelssohn and Henry Willis and others, and was necessary for the performance of the music of Bach and Mendelssohn himself. Best was the first organist at St. George's Hall in Liverpool and retained that post from 1855 to 1894. He played 3 concerts weekly during that period, and he also traveled both to other centers in England to open organs like the Royal Albert Hall in London, and he also came out to Australia to open the organ in the Sydney Town Hall. Meanwhile, he taught and played at various churches in the greater Liverpool area. More about his life and examples of his skill with words, as well as notes, can be found in an extensive article by Orlando Mansfield, and I have put that on the back page for further reading. Today, Best is primarily known as an editor and transcriber, at which tasks he was particularly conscientious. In the 2 transcriptions I'm playing today, as in all the rest of that marvelous collection, there are indications in small type of the voicing or instrumentation of the original score. While these were in no way intended as registrational suggestions, they allow the player an ongoing guide as to what the composer actually wrote. Best indicates which manual to use, and a study of the specification of the organ at St. George's Hall, which you have in your handout, can be instructive when combined with the original instrumentation. And here I wish to quote Mansfield on a somewhat extended quote, which you will find towards the back of the handout. He said, "Best has been accused of occasionally demanding impossible things on the part of the performer, particularly in the matter of crescendo and diminuendo, when both feet and hands were otherwise occupied. This, and many other criticisms were founded on a misunderstanding. Many of the apparently impossible expression marks were inserted because they were in the original. They were never intended to be observed in the organ performance, since it was necessary to sacrifice them there in order to secure a better general effect. Then, many of Best's registration directions appear fantastic or even absurd, but were not so when it was remembered that they mostly applied to the organ at St. George's Hall, which, fortunately or otherwise, was the one which Best usually seemed to have in mind when transcribing for his instrument. The too literal adherence to his directions would cause trouble. But none but the merest tyro would imagine that when Best wrote his favorite direction, Great Viola, 8-foot, that he meant every other stop on the great organ to be silenced except that mentioned. All that Best was demanding was the employment of string tone on the great, only he had his own way of asking for it. Close quote. Even in the 1870s, as Best's editions of music from continental Europe as well as England were being published by Novello, Algener, Boosey, and other publishers, his approach wasn't universally beloved. Dr. Albert Peace, his successor at Liverpool, praised him highly, saying, and I quote, "The use of the organ as a concert instrument has worked a revolution, and in this connection the name of W.T. Best is to be forever honored. He was under the necessity of giving regular weekly recitals, and he found the original organ music sadly deficient. In order to form his varied programs, he began arranging. He laid all styles under contribution. He chose good music. He had the ability to transcribe and to perform it, and so he has done more than any other man to extend the resources of his instrument." But Professor Ritter of Vassar College in Boston found little to laud in Best's contributions. And this is where my typing didn't match up. He said, in opposition to their style, and by their, I have to tell you he meant Rink and Schneider and others of the late 18th century, Best and other organists, not being satisfied with that which the organ can do well, and utterly misunderstanding its true aesthetical resources, have tried, assisted by the wonderful improvements in its mechanical construction by ingenious organ builders, to draw it from its sphere, recklessly demanding of its somewhat coy and rather heavy mechanism. Did Ritter know nothing of pneumatic or electric action? And its slow and responsive massive sound, the manifold and rich expressions of modern orchestration. Ingenious as some of their transcriptions of overtures, movements from symphonies and string quartets may be, they are out of place when played on the organ, and when compared with real organ compositions, not worth the trouble of study. Let's see whether we agree with Professor Ritter that these works are not worth the trouble of study. Best himself was steeped in the works of Handel, who seems never to have gone out of fashion in England after his death in 1759. Choruses and solo duet extracts from many of the oratorios would appear to have been almost constantly in rehearsal or performance somewhere throughout both the Hanoverian and early Victorian periods. One cannot be sure of the excellence or otherwise of the performance standard during this time, but it can be said with a reasonable certainty that musical arrangements were on two staves and probably helpful neither to the rehearsal pianist nor to an organist in their layout. The fact that there appears to have been a ready market for publishing these works on three staves for organ solo seems to be indicative of their ongoing popularity. Zion, Now Her Head Shall Raise, which is duet, and the attached chorus, Tune Your Harps, come from one of the many oratorios based on apocryphal books of the Bible, the Book of Judas Maccabeus, and the oratorio Judas Maccabeus HWV 63. The plot centers around the events of 170 to 160 BCE, when the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid Empire, and Judas ends up forming an alliance with Rome against the Seleucids. This work was written in 1746 and meant to be one of a number praising the Duke of Cumberland upon his return from the Battle of Culloden. The aria is interesting in that the duet is written for soprano and mezzo, even though the characters are named Israelitish man and Israelitish woman. It comes from part 2 after the first battle is won and before it becomes known that revenge is on the way. It's unclear whether Best arranged this as if it were a duet for soprano and tenor, because that is what he assumed, or whether he decided that it worked better in the organ context. Possibly, it was a Victorian affectation that all men's parts were sung by men. With the cessation of the creation of castrati, the roles generally had been reverted to mezzos, but propriety may have dictated such change. In any case, our Israelitish man has become a tenor in Best's version and not the possible breeches role implied by mezzo. This gives a gravitas to the arrangement not demonstrated in the original score. Despite this change, Best's version is obviously a soloist/accompanist arrangement spread over 3 manuals and pedal, 1 manual for each soloist and 1 for the orchestra. With the entry of the chorus, that is, tune your harps, the texture contracts to 1 manual and pedal, with indications in the score as to which lines are vocal or instrumental, but no registrational alterations to distinguish one from another. Only with the final cadence of the chorus does the dynamic revert to forte from fortissimo. The notation orchestra is also indicative. From a performance point of view, the notation is quite straightforward, but one must bear in mind the Victorian understanding of Baroque phrasing and ornamentation as well. In preparing this performance, I've had to unlearn the conventions of historically informed performance, and replace them with the conventions of my early piano lessons. You will purposely hear trills beginning on the principal note, and you will not hear hemiolas or other aspects of what would today be considered standard Baroque practice. This approach has been adopted on the principles of a performance informed by the practices of the time and place of the arranger and his understanding of the intentions of the original composer. The other arrangement of Best's that we will hear today is that of Mendelssohn's How Lovely Are the Messengers, a choral section of the Oratorio St. Paul, Opus 36. Here, the lifetimes of composer and arranger overlap. It is even just possible that Best heard Mendelssohn in one of Mendelssohn's appearances in the Birmingham festivals of the early 1840s. Certainly, Mendelssohn's choral and orchestral works would have been familiar to him in their original forms, for these were almost as popular as Handel. Within this short course, there is room for bringing out on a secondary manual individual lines and also dense homophonic textures, and the writing allows for more obvious uses of manual changes and additions and withdrawals of individual stops than the Handel. This time there is a more diverse indication of instruments, such as horns and clarinets, though again without the intention of trying to cover all the changes of orchestral color. I've played this work in recitals in the past and found that listeners do enjoy it, perhaps echoing the trend of a century ago. So far, we have looked at works with both vocal and instrumental components in their original constructions. In order to be as diverse as possible with the genres studied, the third transcription of this program is for instruments alone, and not a mixed consort of strings, winds, brass, and percussion, but of strings alone. I've also moved forward in time somewhat, although not by a huge distance. And here I have to declare a personal connection with Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. By the way, tomorrow would be Barber's 107th birthday. Samuel Barber was born in 1910 and lived till 1981, and he came from West Chensel, Pennsylvania, which is a town about 15 minutes from where I grew up, and he attended the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. He was therefore considered a local by the southeastern Pennsylvania community throughout his life. And I'll digress from that a little further to tell you a personal anecdote. You will all be aware of the television program University Challenge and its format. We had something similar in our high schools at the time that I was going through, and each school provided a team of 4 students, you know the whole thing. Well, one year I was part of that. The round-robin section of the competition was held in the various school auditoriums with students from the host school in the audience. In our home game, the name this piece of music question was, you guessed it, Adagio for Strings. Of course, I pressed the buzzer after the first full chord, and as all these stories go, the crowd went wild because I was a nerd. And suddenly here was this nerd who knew something. Ever since, I've had a soft spot in my heart for all of Barbara's works, but especially this one. This particular piece, Adagio for Strings, was originally conceived for string quartet, but arranged by the composer for string orchestra in 1936. Its premiere performance was by the NBC Symphony under Toscanini in 1938, and that was broadcast across the US from New York City. Toscanini also took the work on tour, and it became one of America's most universally recognized pieces. Almost from its first performance, the Adagio became the signifier of national and later international mourning. It was played for the announcements of the deaths of Presidents Roosevelt and Kennedy, at the funerals of Albert Einstein and Princess Grace, who's another Philadelphian made good. More recently, it has featured in its orchestral form at the Olympic Games of Vancouver in 2010, concerts and commemorations of loss of life in Paris and Brussels, and state funerals in Canada and Singapore. And in this particular connection, I played the transcription you are about to hear at a memorial concert here in this church in 2011, after the deaths of 3 organ builders in the Christchurch earthquakes. 2 of the people killed had just finished the installation of this instrument 2 weeks previously. This arrangement was produced by William Strickland, assistant organist at St. Bartholomew's Church, New York City, after he heard the Toscanini broadcast. At first, Barbara was not terribly interested in having a transcription made, but by 1945, he and Strickland had become good friends, and Barbara wrote to him, and I quote, "Schirmers have had several organ arrangements submitted of my Adagio for Strings, and many inquiries as to whether it exists for organ. I've always turned them down, as I know little about the organ, but I am sure your arrangement would be best. Have you got the one you did before? If not, would you be willing to make it anew? And if so, will you ever be in New York on leave so I could discuss it with you and hear it? If it is done at all, I should like it done as well as possible, and this by you. They would pay you a fee for the arrangement, although I don't suppose it will be very much. However, that is their affair. Let me know what you think about it." Close quote. Thus, Strickland's arrangement was published in 1949 with registrations for both pipe and Hammond organs, and it is, to my knowledge, the only version of this work for the organ. To round off this program of transcriptions, I've chosen a work originally written for the organ by the Belgian Jacques Nicolas Lemmens, who lived from 1823 to 1881, as a part of his L'École d'Orgue, or organ school. As a composer, Lemmens won the Paris Conservatory's Prix de Rome in 1847, and as a performer, he'd been a student of Thesis, who sent him to Adolf Friedrich Hess to learn the Bach tradition. And this whole thing of the generations of who studied with whom and the kind of genealogy is still in play today, because Lemmens studied with Hess, who studied with Rink, who studied with Kittel, who studied with Bach. And you still have people who trace their genealogy back that way. But by 1849, age 26, Lemmens had been appointed teacher of the organ at the Royal Brussels Conservatory, and amongst his students were Alexandre Guillemot and Charles-Marie Widor. Even with contemporary works, editions by other organists were and are common. Thus, we return to our friend W.T. Best, who edited this work for Schott Publishers as part of their ongoing series of colorful albums for the organ. They went through the rainbow and a bit more, eventually publishing 12 volumes. 11 of them are there on the table, and I'm playing from the 12th one. The only notable addition, aside from translating the French registrations into English, is some curious fingering. The thumb is indicated by a plus sign, and the fingers by 1, 2, 3, 4, unlike the more standard keyboard practice of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So as one plays through this score, one needs to bear in mind that 1 does not equal the thumb. Why best use this system, I don't know. And at first it puzzled me, but now it is simply a characteristic of Best's work. So, does the concept of transcription pass the ultimate musical test, that of the discerning ear? The answer, I believe, is yes. Arrangements of works made by earlier composers such as Bach are sometimes more well-known than their originals. If one approaches the question with an open mind, accepting that original and transcription are not intended to be identical in every detail, there is room for transcription from well-known original forms, opera, symphony, so on, to the organ in its orchestral persona. Perhaps the proof is in the listening. Thank you very much. Before I adjourn to the other end of the building, if anybody would like to ask questions, this is perhaps an appropriate time to do that. Deadly hush. Well, in that case, I'll proceed to the organ, and you will hear the works as in the order as outlined in the handout. The only other thing I should tell you about Liverpool Town Hall is that there are some pictures, if you Google that, of the original mosaic tile floor, which are absolutely stunning. 30,000 pieces of Minton china tiles, but they keep them covered up now most of the year, which is probably a good thing. But it's all been restored, so it's all in good nick.